Greetings and welcome to Understanding John Locke, the Smart Student's Guide to Locke's Second Treatise of Government. I am Professor Houlgate, the author, and if you have the time, you might want to pick up a copy of the book that I'm reading from during these podcasts. Just go to Amazon.com, and when you're there, just do a short search. Use my last name, Houlgate. Remember, it has a U in it, Houlgate, Lawrence, the first name. And just write in the word John Locke, and you'll come up with either a digital or a paperback version will be offered to you for purchase. The digital, of course, would be immediate, and then you could immediately start reading along with me. But if you don't want to do either of those, welcome. I welcome everyone, non-book owners and book owners. We are now at chapter 10 of my book on John Locke. It has the title, The Extent of Legislative Power. Actually, I'm going to cram a couple of chapters into one, a couple of Locke's chapters. He has a chapter 10, and he has a chapter 11. So I decided just for clarity purposes, we're going to put both of these together because one does lead to the other. We're going to talk about forms of government, the variety of forms of government that Locke says is consistent with his earlier law of nature. And we're going to see the recommendations in Locke's chapter 11 about the limits of legislative power. Locke makes recommendations about the limits of legislative power, but he doesn't show much concern about limits on freedom of speech, religion, assembly, limits on the right to bear arms, or limits on searches and seizure. As we're going to see, Locke's concern is only with what today we would call the rule of law and how it should be applied to the misuse of political power. So let's get on now with the forms of government, the first part of what I talked about. Locke writes that, quote, the first and fundamental positive law of all commonwealths is the establishing of the legislative power. The legislative power is, of course, the right to make and change law. This right is initially placed in the hands of the majority of the community, although the majority may decide to place it elsewhere. For example, they could take that power and put it in the hands of a few select men, or even in the hands of one man if they wished. If left in the hands of the majority, then the form of government is called democracy. That would be John Locke's definition. But if it's in the hands of a few select persons, it is called an oligarchy, and in the hands of one person, it is called monarchy. And Locke says this, if to him and his heirs it is a hereditary monarchy, if to him only for life, but upon his death the power only of nominating a successor to return to them, then it's called an elective monarchy. So if the form of government depends upon who has the legislative power, then the decision about where to place this power lies entirely in the hands of the community. As Locke says, they could retain that power unto themselves, or they can dispose of it into the hands that they please, and to constitute a new form of government. Locke doesn't state a preference for any one of these forms of government, be it a democracy, an oligarchy, or a monarchy, hereditary or elective. The supreme power, though, in any independent community is to be found wherever the legislative power is placed. If it is placed in the hands of a hereditary monarch, then she is the supreme power, at least until a majority of the community decides to remove it from her and place it elsewhere. And this they can do, by the way. The next section of my chapter is 10.2, and here I'm going to be commenting on, and I hope I'm not confusing you, on Locke's chapter 11 in the Second Treatise of Government. So 10.2 in Houlgate. One of the most important questions in political philosophy is about the limits that the people can justifiably place on the legislative power. In the USA, the United States of America, these restrictions are to be found in the first 10 amendments of our U.S. Constitution, otherwise known as the Bill of Rights. For example, although the United States Congress has the power to make federal law, this power is restricted by the First Amendment, which says, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So, if a majority in Congress voted to make Christianity the official religion of the United States, this would immediately be struck down by the United States Supreme Court as an unconstitutional breach of the First Amendment. Similar actions by the court would be taken if Congress were to create a law declaring that there be no public criticism of a sitting president, or a law stipulating that it is illegal to peaceably assemble in front of the White House to protest unpopular actions of the president or the Congress of the United States. Locke's concern is not explicitly about any of the freedoms guaranteed in the First Amendment. His concern is about the preservation of society. He writes that the legislative power is governed by the, quote, first and fundamental natural law, which is the preservation of society and every person in it. That's paragraph 134 of Second Treatise. This defines the limits of legislative power. It presumably tells us that this power can only be used for the end of preserving what Locke calls property, namely life, liberty, and possessions. But we at least know from these words that the legislative power is not, nor can possibly be, absolutely arbitrary over the lives and fortunes of the people. Suppose that the people appoint one person as legislator, thereby forming a monarchy. They name her Queen Makeda. As the legislator, Queen Makeda cannot be given more power in civil society than the power that she had in the state of nature before civil society was formed. And Locke says this, for nobody can transfer to another more power than she has in herself, and nobody has an absolute arbitrary power over herself or any other to destroy her own life or to take away the life or property of another. Paragraph 135. Before she was appointed queen, Makeda did not have the power to destroy her own life or that of another, nor did anyone else have this power. Therefore, these powers cannot be transferred to her as queen. However, like all others in the state of nature, Makeda does have the power of self-preservation, and she has the power to punish. Hence, these powers are transferable, and Makeda can legitimately create and execute the laws that protect her subjects from harm to their life, liberty, health, or possessions. Now, on a side panel, I say that the above argument limiting legislative power is very simple. It has 3 steps. It goes like this. First step, or first premise, persons can only have the legislative power in civil society that they had in the state of nature. Premise 2, in the state of nature, no one has the power to destroy the life or take the property of others. Step 3, that is the conclusion. Therefore, no one in civil society has the legislative power to destroy the life or take the property of others. You can call that conclusion an if-then proposition in which the former of the two, that is the first part, civil society, is defined as having the legislative power to destroy the life or not has the legislative power not to take the life or property of others, okay? The one involves the other logically, conceptually. The concept of civil society, for Locke, means that no one in civil society has the legislative power to destroy the life or take the property of others. True by definition. Now, the next section of this chapter. There are 4 restrictions on legislative power. This, again, is in Chapter 11 of Second Treatise. The first restriction has already been noted. The legislative power can be no more than those persons had in the state of nature before they entered into society. The second restriction is that legislators cannot rule by, quote, extemporary arbitrary decrees. Locke here appears to be discussing one of the essential features of the rule of law, namely the necessity of promulgating laws to the public once they are made. Justice can only be dispensed if there are promulgated standing laws and known authorized judges. Promulgated means to distribute the laws so that everybody knows about them. And known authorized judges is obvious. That is, people with the right to enforce the laws. So justice can only be dispensed if we have those two propositions enacted. That is, that there are promulgated standing laws and known authorized justice. If persons in civil society are not governed by declared laws, then Locke says their peace, their quiet, and property will still be at the same uncertainty as it was in the state of nature. That is, without those two propositions being true, then you would never have left the state of nature. If there were no laws promulgated, for example, there were no authorized judges, then you're still in the state of nature. You are not in civil society. Side remark. In the 20th century, the legal philosopher Lon Fuller argued that genuine systems of laws are those in which legislators have a moral duty to create general rules and not make decisions on an ad hoc basis. They must publicize these rules that people are expected to obey, and they must make these rules understandable. Systems of regulation and control that do not meet these minimum requirements are systems that simply fail to respond to human beings as agents capable of deliberation and choice. As such, they don't qualify as systems of laws. Let's go back to Locke now. Legislators cannot take from anyone any part of their property without their own consent. So I cannot take from anyone any part of his or her property without his or her own consent. Now, the reason for this restriction is obvious. No one would leave the state of nature for civil society unless they were assured that their property would be protected from arbitrary seizure by those who have legislative power. Locke recognizes that he is assuming an affirmative answer to the question, do all people have property to lose when they enter society? His reply is yes, they must have property to lose, or it would be an absurdity to say that the end for which they enter society is to secure it. Remember again now that the word property, used by Locke, means life, liberty, and possessions. Don't get it confused with real estate. He's not talking about that only. He's also talking about life and liberty, and it would be an absurdity to say that people must have property to lose. But why assume, and this is a question, why assume that each person in the state of nature has property to lose when he or she entered civil society? Critics of Locke might point out the possibility that some people in the state of nature might have no property at all, especially if they had never used their own labor to take something from the commons. Well, the answer to that should be obvious by now, because Locke means more than possessions. He means life and liberty as well. That objection ignores these earlier remarks made by Locke. First, Locke wrote that every man has property in his own person, every man and woman. Second, the word property refers not only to land, estates, or to things taken from the commons, but also to lives and liberties. Look at paragraph 119 in Second Treatise to bear that out. So Locke is not making an empirical claim about the relationship between persons and property as they move from the state of nature to civil society. Instead, Locke's point is analytical, or conceptual, if you will. Since people in the state of nature necessarily have property in their own person, in their life, and in their liberty, it follows that it is not an absurdity to say that the end for which they enter society is to secure their property. In fact, it's logically true. The fourth point to make, and you didn't know that I just made three, you can go back over, this is the fourth point and final point in the chapter. Once the people have given legislative power to one person or body of persons, that person cannot transfer it somewhere else. Quote, the people alone can appoint the form of the commonwealth. which is by constituting the legislative and appointing in whose hands that shall be. Let me repeat that. I'm going to put it in a different phrasing. Only the people can appoint the form of the Commonwealth. By the form of the Commonwealth, he means a democracy, a monarchy, or an oligarchy, or maybe something else. And they do this by appointing the form of the Commonwealth. It is by constituting the legislative, that is, who makes the laws, and by appointing in whose hands that shall be. The people are making a positive voluntary grant to make laws, not to make legislators. The power of making laws is transferred from the people to the legislators, and this is all that is conveyed. The authority of making laws cannot be placed in other hands by them. So that's the end of this section. We're at 15 minutes and 50 seconds. And in the next chapter of this, we're going to be looking at the separation of powers. Next week, we're going to discuss materials from chapters 12, 13, and 14 of Second Treatise. If you want to read ahead, please go ahead and do that, and then I'll be making comments in my chapter 11 from my book in our next podcast. Thank you for listening, and over and out.